Okay, so we're going to start the beginners Pilates section with a warm-up, and to begin we're just going to go through a quick posture check so you can check your alignment at the beginning of the class. So feet hip distance apart, tripods engaged, so the tripod is the ball of the big toe, the outer edge of the foot and the centre of each heel. So we're just placing even pressure through those 3 points, and also trying not to lock the knees here, very important for good posture, so taking the knees off lock. Also lengthening the sides of the body, nice and tall away from the hips, along the lateral aspect towards the rib cage, shoulder blades down away from the ears and points of the elbows back. And then to finish, lengthening through the crown of the head, nice and upright. So the first exercise we're going to do for the warm-up is the roll down. We're going to do 3 at the beginning of the class, and we're going to compare those with 1 at the end, just so you can assess how much more flexible and open you feel at the end of the class. So I'm just going to start side on.
Take a deep breath in through the nose, ocean breath out through the mouth, curling the spine forward 1 bone at a time. Deep breath in at the bottom. Exhale to slowly curl up, pulling in the lower abdominals and shoulder blades down away from the ears. So each time you curl forward, trying to imagine peeling the spine off an imaginary wall. Exhale, slowly curling up, imprinting that spine back up that wall, 1 bone at a time. On the 3rd repetition, you're just going to give a mark out of 10 for any areas of tension you have, and then you can compare at the end of the class.
Okay, and the next stretch we're going to do are a series of arm swings just to open up the upper back and mobilise the shoulder joints and encourage good upper back posture for the rest of the session today. So we're going to start with our feet again in that hip distance apart stance, and the arm's going to be out in front. Left hand is palm down, right hand is palm up. Deep breath in, and then deep exhalations to take the arms back.
So you want to be breathing out to take the arms back behind. So it's a very short breath in through the nose and a deep sigh through the mouth, closing the rib cage as the arms go back. So you're trying to encourage the core to work on the exhalation.
And the second variation is just to open the front of the shoulder, and again just encourage good upper back posture.
For this exercise, you need to make sure that the shoulders don't hike up towards the ears and that the palms stay upright. So if the palm starts to come forward as your arms go back, it means you've taken the hands too far. Again, keep closing the rib cage to take the arms back.
And the 3rd version is for just a bit of circumduction through the shoulder joint, so just slightly different kind of movement for the shoulder, as well as starting to mobilise the hips and challenge your balance at the beginning of the class. And then we're going to move on to the wall for a final stretch before we come down to the floor to start the beginners main section. So the final stretch we're going to do for the warm-up is going to be at the wall, or you can take it to a door frame for a slightly stronger stretch. And it's for your QL, which is the lower lumbar back muscle that runs up the side towards the rib cage. So you might feel it stretching quite high up towards the ribs here as well. So we're just going to start, I'll start you off in the position and then I'll show you the stretch. So you're going to start with your feet approximately hip distance apart, approximately hip distance away from the wall. This will differ depending on how tight your back is. If it is tighter, you might have to stand slightly closer to the wall. The hands are going to be positioned with the outside hand over at forehead level and the inside hand at hip level. If you're on a wall, your hand is going to be flat, but I'm just using the window frame here just to wrap my fingers around, which is a slightly stronger stretch. It might be too strong for any shoulder issues. The outside leg crosses over, and your aim here is to press the outside hip away. So I'm just going to hold it for 8 breaths.
Lengthen the crown of the head towards the wall, and you're looking for 2 points of elongation. One through the uppermost hand, which is pressing firmly into the wall or the door frame, and then you're sort of hanging off the door frame or wall, pressing the outside shoulder blade away simultaneously.
There is a variation here I'll show you for the last 4 breaths. Turning the inside foot to the wall, just to take any pressure that you might have off the back. The outside leg needs to be turned in so the hips are square.
Press the pubic bone forward towards the wall, engaging the lower abdominal area here, so that's going to support your lower back. If this feels too strong on the neck, just look down to the floor, less rotation.
And we're just going to move down to the mat for one final movement as part of the beginner's warm-up section. Okay, so we're going to do the partial roll back just to mobilise the lower portion of the spine and just bring your awareness into your deep lower abdominal area before we begin the main section. And I prefer to use a pad just between the knees. You could use a small cushion or a thick towel rolled up. There's 2 positions. The first one I'll demonstrate with the arms just in line with your shoulders, and they stay in line with your shoulders at all times until you come forward out of the position.
Exhale to sink and curl back, looking into the groin, staying where the back stays round. Deep breath in. Exhale to contract the spine forward and slowly roll up. Lengthening through the crown of the head, so we're going to tuck under so that posterior tilt of the pelvis, pubic bone forward. Hold it there, open the hand 6 inches, curling forward, 1 bone at a time. As you curl back, we're trying to focus on keeping the lower lumbar area in flexion. The hands come forward and down on the last repetition. So we're just doing 3. Exhale, slowly drawing the hands forward and up.
And the second variation is more for challenging your upper back posture and working higher up into the abdominals in your rectus abdominis and your external obliques in the front section. The arms are folded one over the other like a genie or a Cossack.
Exhale to sink, tuck, roll back, look into the groin where the lower back is round. Draw the arms back as far as you comfortably can. So what we're looking for here is to maintain the lumbar flexion when the arms go above the head. So squeeze the core from the sides at this point, and then slowly flexing the spine to curl forward again. When we flex, we're using the lower abdominal muscles and the pelvic floor. And then when we extend and draw the arms up, we're pulling in the muscles at the side of the abdomen. And we're holding this one for 3 counts. Last one, shoulders down, nice and relaxed, and then slowly curling up.
And that's the beginner's warm-up finished. Okay, so this is the main Pilates section for more of a beginner level, just to guide you through various different types of movement in various alignments. So the first alignment I'm going to show you will be lying on our back, and for this you need a thick head cushion or rolled up towel for supporting your head, which will just give you a nice alignment through your upper back. So you may find that your back is already in a much better position as you have a pad under the head, but we also try to stretch the lower back along the mat here, so we're not in a neutral spine position because we've actually imprinted the lower back into the floor. We're going to use a bridge position to get into our first alignment. and we're just imprinting the spine down. And you'll feel yourself coming down the mat slightly. You might have to adjust your head pad there. That just brings the lower back in contact with the floor. It's not the same as tucking and imprinting in a traditional sense, because that will compact your lower back discs. Lengthening through the crown of the head, lengthening through the fingers, and feet about hip distance apart, and that's your start position. Okay, so the first exercise we're going to do in supine is a variation of scissors, and we're just using this one really to just start working the core muscles a little bit deeper without bringing the head forward off the floor at this stage.
Slowly float one leg up at a time so you don't strain the back. Exhale to lower one leg down to the floor slowly with control. We're continuously working the lower abdominals to keep the back supported, and we're also closing the ribs by squeezing the core from the sides as the leg lowers down.
And I'll just show you an instance of where that could go wrong before we carry on. So we don't want that to happen, so it's really important that you make sure you don't lower the leg too low, and if at any point you feel any pressure in your back, just place your thumbs just behind the hip bone. You'll feel the bony prominence at the back of the hip, and just place your thumb there just to secure the lower back, and of course engaging the core continuously.
So we're not going to concern ourselves too much with whether you have a neutral position in the spine. It's more about keeping the pelvis in neutral, so the pubic bone and pelvic bones are lying parallel.
And the next exercise we're going to do is a variation of hundreds. And for this one, we're going to keep our feet down for the beginner's level variation. If you do want to progress the exercise, I'll show you that as well. So I'm just returning my back into that position we had to start with, making sure there's no gaps in the lower back at all. So the pelvis is in neutral, where your pubic bone and your hip bones are lying flat. They're not imprinting into the lower back, so the pubic bone isn't pushing up, but your lower back is gently in contact with the floor. There's no force there. It's no longer in a neutral position.
Exhale to lift the sternum to the ceiling. Press the head back into the hands with 5% pressure to ensure that you're not pulling on the head or neck. Extend one leg up at a time. If here you start to feel pressure, just place that leg back down and keep the feet on the floor. The importance here is to keep the lower back just lightly pressing down to the floor and scooping the abdominals. If you see the abdominals doming, which is where they start to come up, or you feel your back working here, it means that you need to raise the legs up in the air, higher, more vertical above the hip. If you still feel pressure in the back, you need to take one leg down to the floor at a time and continue with the feet on the floor. You can adapt the exercise further by bending the knees in slightly.
And just release off with a knees to chest stretch there. The next exercise is the single leg circle, and we're going to start with just a semicircle variation, just a smaller range of movement, and then we'll take it up to the full version. For this one, it's really important, the working leg, which is going to be my right leg to start, that you keep the leg, the back of the hip in contact with the floor. You don't hitch the hip up off the floor because that's going to shorten the waist and you might feel pressure into the lower back. You may also find that your inner thigh starts to feel strained in that position. I'm going to place my thumb of my left hand just behind my left hip. It's not your whole hand, so you're not leaning over like this, you're just sliding your thumb behind your hip just to support your lower back during the exercise so you're not rolling around on that hip.
Exhale to lower the leg down to the floor. Squeeze the core from the opposite side as the leg circles up. The aim here is to try to keep the hips stable. In the original form of this exercise, there was movement in the hip, but we're trying to focus on stability for this one and also mobilizing through the hip joint.
And we're going to do the progression, so extending the leg down. Only do this if you have the flexibility to keep your right hip comfortably, your right leg comfortably above your right hip. If the leg is over here, that's going to pull on your back.
So we need to focus on squeezing the core from the opposite side to the leg that's working. So you're pulling in your core from the left-hand side here as your right leg moves. There will be a little bit of movement in the hip, but as we're controlling the movement.
And make sure you repeat on the opposite side.
Close the ribs as the leg lowers to the floor. And remember to squeeze the core from the opposite side the way the leg is turning.
If you find that when you're circling the leg, particularly as you take the leg out to the side, that you feel a lateral rotation in the hips and your right hip is moving off the floor, you feel your rib cage lifting off, you may want to place a thin piece of towel behind the rib. And that will just get the core to engage a little bit better on that side, just to support and stabilise the hips.
So really you're just aiming to minimise the movement in the pelvis here. And to, again, take the exercise up. If you have the flexibility to do so, coming into a full circle where there will be more movement in the hip, but the upper back is secure to the floor, and keeping the eyes straight up to the ceiling if possible, rather than following the leg, which will move the head round, which we don't want. Full body stretch just to release off afterwards.
And the next exercise we're going to do is rolling like a ball. So we remove the head cushion because we don't want to press the neck into the head pads. Make sure there's nothing behind you. And it's a variation of rolling like a ball, so we're just massaging the middle of the back. The hands are behind either thigh, they're not interlaced here, and the feet are quite wide and flexed, pushing up to the ceiling behind you. The head is always off the floor, and at no point should you roll back on the neck or even the top of the shoulders here. We're very much working just in the middle portion of the back.
We use a short, sharp blast to come up, and that helps to activate the core. You're using the momentum of the legs really here to move, and your eyes are looking at a fixed point in front.
If you did want to progress the exercise, you start in a seated position. Again, making sure there's nothing behind. The hands this time are on top of either shin, and the forehead is between the knees.
So it's knees to nose to roll back, nose to knees to curl up. So just keep your focus on the knees at all times here. We're not using momentum, we're using the core to control the movement.
So before I continue to the next exercise, just to point out, it's really important to have a thick Pilates mat, a centimetre or so in thickness, to perform the rolling like a ball exercise, because otherwise it's not going to feel very comfortable on the spine. And it is a great feeling rolling, but if it doesn't feel good, then please do the version from the floor. The next exercise is lying back on the floor for bridge. Okay, so the next exercise is bridge. We're not using a head cushion for this one either, because we're going to lift our hips higher than our head level, and the general rule is not to have a pad under the head.
Exhale to press the pubic bone up towards the ceiling and slowly peel the spine up. Hold for the breath in, and then exhale to slowly curl down. The hip should come down last. So pubic bone up first, posterior pelvic tilts. Try and keep the length through the upper back here so we're not hyperextending. And lengthen through the fingers. And I'm just going to pop this between my knees, because for the next part of the exercise we're going to be extending one leg, and that's going to just encourage the core to work that bit more effectively, and also encourage the hamstrings and buttocks to engage so that they don't cramp during the exercise. Squeeze the pad, and again curling up the same way as before. Hold the position and extend the leg in the air. So we're going to squeeze the core as the leg extends, trying to keep the back from arching here. So it's just in a neutral position, and the rib cage is closed. Just placing the hands on top here, just so I can feel whether there's any movement in the pelvis. And the elbows are off the floor as well, which is good to challenge your stability in the upper back. So now we're going to go into side lying leg lifts, which is a variation of the side leg series. And I'm going to start with my head at this end, facing towards you, and then on the other side you can just view from the opposite side at opposite angles. You can look at the alignment of my back against your own as you're practicing. So it's really important to use the mat to help align yourself, because you haven't necessarily got someone there to correct your position. So I always use my bottom shoulder against the back edge of the mat, and my hips, which are stacked one on top of the other. The legs are forward about 30 degrees in front of the bottom hip, and there's always 2 points of elongation. So we're lengthening through the heels and then pressing the hips into the floor, and the other point of elongation is through the crown of the head, lengthening in the opposite direction. The hand is going to be placed between the ribs and the floor, and the ribs are not resting on the hand at any point, and equally the hand is not pulling up towards the rib cage. That's just your gauge of whether or not your hips have moved during the exercise. So you're squeezing the inner thighs and pressing through the top hip down towards the heels on the uppermost side. The bottom shoulder may feel like it wants to press into the floor, but you're just going to keep peeling the shoulder blade down away from the ear. And ready to do the same on the other side. So I'm just going to check the alignment of my back against the edge of the mat. So we just want to make sure that the bottom shoulder is pushed to the back edge. There's space between the ear and the bottom shoulder. And again, I'm going to pull that top hip down the mat and create space between the waist and the floor. So the aim here is to keep the top hip stacked directly above the bottom hip. There may be some small movement. We do use general breathing rules, but the main thing to remember really is when you're extending and lengthening, you're breathing in, and when you're tucking and engaging the lower abdominals, you're breathing out. The fingers are relaxed on the floor, and you're just checking all the time the top shoulder is away from the ear. And we're just going to perform a mermaid stretch to release off after the sideline work. So for mermaid stretch,
we can have our legs in this position here, but for some people that might be a bit uncomfortable on the hip, in which case you can bring the leg forward if you need to. You could even have the soles of the feet together. Again, your left hand is going to be on your right knee, but that could also go on your left knee if there's any shoulder impingement there.
To increase the stretch, I look up towards the ceiling and turn my armpit towards the ceiling to increase the stretch, but that's up to you again, depending on your range of movement. Squeeze the core as you come up. So this one really depends on your range of movement as to how far down you come to the floor.
And the next exercise, we're going to be lying on our front for swan.
So for this one, just watch me first, perform the movement, and then do it yourself afterwards.
So there's various hand positions that could be used for swan. It's not the swan dive, we're not using our legs for this version in the beginner section, but we are going to be lifting the upper back and going into back extension. And the hand positions are as follows. So the first one is kind of the position most people will adopt. If you do have any straining in the shoulder or the lower back, you might need to bring your hands forward so that you get a smaller range of movement. And the harder position is to have the hands around just kind of under the shoulders with the elbows tucked in towards the waist. I'm just going to show you the middle position just for the purposes of practicing today.
Draw the shoulder blades down away from the ears. And you're not pushing your hands into the floor to affect a movement. You're actually pulling the shoulders down and breathing in here because you're coming into extension. So it's not always a breath out on the exertion. Because we are going into extension, we're using the core muscles and the side of the abdominal area, the obliques mainly, to extend the spine up, and we're also working the back muscles as well. Try to come up and down like a plank. So we're not rolling through the stomach here. The closer I take my hands to the body, the more range of movement I have, and therefore the harder that's going to be. And just reduce the range of movement if you need to.
And always finish back extension going into a child's pose stretch just to release off the spine.
This is full rest position with the head on the floor.
So we're going to go into rotation next, sitting up. The legs should be together, but if that's strains the hip flexors too much here, or for example your back is in a lot of flexion and it feels uncomfortable, you could take the legs wider.
I'm slightly sinking before I rotate. Traditionally, you would use a neutral spine as you rotate, but you actually achieve a greater range of movement with a small amount of flexion in the lumbar spine. There are contraindications for certain back problems. So we're using what we call a percussion breath just to achieve a greater range of movement. So the first breath is like a prep for the second pulsing action. Looking up and over the shoulder.
And we're going to finish the beginner's main section with a plank, and it's a forearm plank. So we start in a Sphinx position, palms facing down, with the fingertips just at the edge of the mat so you know that you're not pushing your fingers into the floor. Connect the legs together just to get the inner thighs working, and also here just make sure there's no pressure in the lower back. If there is any pressure, take the easier option.
Start by drawing in the lower abdominals. Raise up onto the knees or just above the knees so your back is in a neutral spine position. Squeeze the core from the sides here. And once you're in a fully supported position, there's no straining in the back, you can curl the toes under and lengthen into forearm plank. You need to squeeze your core and lift the pelvic floor, pulling in the core from the sides all the way around. If you need to come back down again during the movement because you feel any straining in the back, please do so straight away.
We're going to go into a child's pose again, and then we're also going to do another stretch which is similar to a cat stretch in yoga. So instead of doing a cat stretch, which is on all fours, we're just going to come down onto our elbows instead. Feet are out wider than the knees, and that's going to stop you pushing the hips back during the stretch, and we're just going to focus on the lower back rather than the shoulders for this one. So try to keep the shoulders down away from the ears throughout. You will feel a small amount of movement in the upper back, but the reason we've come down onto the elbows is so that we can focus on the lumbar spine. So your head shouldn't be dropping down at all during the stretch. Keep the eyes roughly on the wrist line or the forearm line, depending on your range of movement. We're pulling in your lower abdominals here, squeezing the core, lifting the pelvic floor to control the downward movement. And we're just going to do a couple of stretches with the ball. So I'm just going to use a tennis ball, very inexpensive, very versatile piece of equipment that can be used to release tight fascia, which is the connective tissue behind the muscle. And that under tension can cause a lot of discomfort and make it difficult for you to get a good stretch when you're doing just regular stretching from day to day. So I'm just going to show you a couple of stretches with the ball to begin with. The first one we're going to do is just for your pectoral muscles in the chest area here. And we're just going to take the tennis ball and put firm pressure, one hand on top of the other, and just start by using long strokes back and forth. And it might feel difficult to take a deep breath in, but you're going to try to just do deep breaths in and out. And then small circular motions as well as it starts to release off. You could also use a trigger point technique where you just hold the ball with some firm pressure without moving the ball across the chest. And you want to be here for a minimum of 30 seconds and up to 2 minutes maximum, so you don't overstimulate the muscle. And you probably caused a red mark there, and then change over onto the other side. You don't have to be sitting like this if it's uncomfortable. You could be sat on a chair or standing. Okay, so chest should be nice and open, but now we're also going to do the opposing muscle group. So we're going to stretch the back of the shoulder. This can be a little bit more tricky to get into. So best to have a head pad to support the head as you're stretching. So we're going to come down onto the floor for this one. So we're just going to place the ball behind the shoulder and the head on the pad. So you're just using gravity to just reduce any tension in the back of the shoulder. And you could also use a technique where you roll from side to side. So another 10 seconds or so. Just make sure that you do release that tension a little bit before you come away from the stretch. So about there. And again, so notice the red marks there, and then on the other side as well.
So try to give a mark out of 10, 10 being pain, and try to assess that during the stretch. And you just want to reduce that mark by 1 or 2 notches before you move on to another section.
If you don't have a head pad or you don't feel your head supported enough, you could support your hands behind your head.
This kind of feels slightly awkward for some people. If it doesn't feel good at any point, then stop immediately.
And that's the end of the beginner's Pilates format.